Thanks, Carolyn. Appreciate it. And just to reiterate your thanks to the participants, really appreciate your time today. Today we're going to share several things. We're going to primarily focus on some customer research we've done and also some research we've done on top performers and really dig into some specifics in terms of what they're doing, how they're doing it, in an effort to consistently improve their customers' experience. So with that, let's jump over to the agenda and review kind of our flow for today's conversation. I'm going to briefly touch base on where we get our data. We're going to talk about the value of a cross-industry perspective. Then we're going to touch on top drivers of the customer experience across channels, some very interesting characteristics of what drives the customer experience across specific channels, and we'll delve into some of the reasons why. Then we're going to talk about three metrics. There's so many metrics, but there's three key metrics that top performers are constantly looking at and mastering, if you will, to drive performance. Right after that, I'm going to share very briefly with you some of how J.D. Power helps their customers. That won't take too long, but want to make sure those of you who are not aware of some of the things that we do for organizations do become aware of that. And then lastly, we're going to transition to what's working right now to drive a great customer experience during this particular time where things are changing so quickly. Okay, so real quickly, there are some pillars around J.D. Power. First and foremost is the voice of the customer. So we're going to share with you some data that's derived from a few sources. The first source is our VOC research across over 50 studies, over 1,000 companies that we've looked at in terms of how customers feel about interacting with them across multiple channels. And we also ask not only sentiment questions like courtesy and concern, knowledge, promptness, and timeliness in resolving your issue, but we also ask a lot of diagnostic questions, and those diagnostic questions oftentimes help us really understand operationally what companies are good at and where they have some opportunities. But again, that is those standards, if you will, are based on what customers feel about an organization, that we're able to correlate certain operational realities like holds or transfers, asking folks to repeat information with the actual experience. So all of that impact information on a cross-industry level is derived from these studies. It's updated every single year, right? Obviously, things are changing quickly, so we have to stay on top of that. And I'm going to share some of that data with you year over year today. Through our certification program, we're able to really isolate what top performers do. And our view of top performers isn't those companies that conduct their operations for the least total cost. It is those companies that have a verifiable, that deliver a verifiably great customer experience. So for us, that's the first and foremost driver. We'll share with you some stats and strategies that help affect significant cost drivers like agent attrition and first contact resolution, today's webcast, but it's all in service of creating this outstanding customer experience. So our CERT program allows us to actually really understand at a more detailed and nuanced level what these top performers are doing. In fact, we've been in over 400 of these contact centers to better understand the linkages between strategy all the way through, technology, the processes that are implemented, who the people are, how they hire the people in service of delivering an outstanding customer experience. And these practices are updated annually as well. Naturally, there's a core set of practices that are always going to be applicable, but some of the specific practices that organizations are utilizing to provide this level of experience are changing, and we essentially codify those and offer those up to our clients. Okay, so all of that being said, obviously, if we've been, across 50 industry studies, and then we've been in these over 400 centers, we have really seen a lot of value in the cross-industry perspective, but of course, that's nothing new. I was just recently doing a presentation, actually here in Austin, Texas, where I live, and I didn't have one person in the room not agree with this statement, essentially that a good experience anywhere influences the expectations everywhere, right? So customer satisfaction is the nexus between these customer expectations, you see that curve on the left-hand side, and provider performance. So every time, whether you're in, if you take an average consumer and they make a contact, via phone, web, or chat, or social, they have this experience, and it's very likely that they are having this experience across industries. And so as the provider performance increases, the customer expectations also start to increase. And then you come across some of these top performers. So I listed a few out here that you've undoubtedly heard of, Zappos, USAA, Discover, and then some of these other organizations which may not necessarily be a household name. Obviously, everyone's heard of Delta, but Guardian is an awesome company. They're in the Fortune 260, 265 range. They sell annuities, retirement products, life insurance, and they're not necessarily a company that jumps out at you, but wow, what a great experience that they provide their customers. Same with Swift Capital, another company that isn't necessarily a household name, but along with Delta this past year, in our certification program, they actually all scored on a 0 to 1,000 point scale above a 900. So if you start thinking about, wow, how is that even possible? I mean, the average score across every single attribute is above a 9 on a 10-point scale, and all of the diagnostics that contribute to the impression that customers have of the organization, how quickly they answer the phone, were they put on hold, when they are put on hold, did they meet customer expectations, what was their transfer rate, was there any confusion about next steps? All of these things, they are consistently scoring over and over again in the 9. So it's just an amazing feat. But when you run into some of these companies, that immediately is going to affect your perception of any given experience that you have. So it's one of those things that we all, as organizations, whether we want to deal with it or not, whether we think it's fair or not, there's just the simple reality is that a good experience anywhere really does influence the expectation everywhere, and it really becomes important to understand then, if that's the case, and those folks on the phone agree with what I'm saying, is that you have to understand completely who is doing what well out there, because that is going to influence your customer's perception of you. So it's very important to embrace this concept, if you will. So the next slide is just a quick illustration. Many of you have joined these webcasts in the past, have seen this illustration before, but this just gives you an idea of a client who we worked with. This is their score in the triangle, and the question is this good? And this underscores the power of a cross-industry perspective, because without a frame of reference, it is difficult to ascertain if your performance in any of these areas. So what you see here are the questions that we ask in our certification program, but many clients who aren't pursuing certification, they just want to see how they compare against top performers in order to identify gaps. You can see that these are the questions at the bottom. So you have question 22 is promptness and speaking to a person. In this case, the client scored a 7.52 out of a 1 to 10 scale. Knowledge is the next one at 23. They scored a 7.7. Courtesy, 8.19 out of 10. Representative concern for your needs, 7.82. And then down here, timeliness, resolving your problem, question, or request, 7.34. And then all of these individual answers are actually correlated and regressed against this overall customer service representative experience question. That way we're able to derive importance weights. So in this case, absence of data, it's very difficult to draw any conclusion on whether or not this is good. Now when you look at this same view, this same data rather, with now in context, we can see that in fact these particular scores are not great, right? If you compare this client to cross-industry averages, they do okay. In some cases, they exceed cross-industry average. Unfortunately, this particular organization, just like most of the organizations on the phone, are being compared, again, to those experienced across all industries. And when you have this great experience, so that's represented by the average certified score. You can see in column 1 over here in promptness as an example, well, they're a full point behind the average certified score of 8.52 on this question of how satisfied are you in how quickly you're able to speak to a person. Average certified 8.52 average, and this client 7.52. So the point is that you have to have an objective standard by which to compare yourself. Now, when you do that and you combine these gaps, so you see these gaps here between the triangle and the diamond, let alone the score at the very, very top, which shows the highest score for each one of these questions within our certified program. But when you see the comparison, that creates a gap, and then when you take into account those gaps by the relative importance of each one of these questions, because timeliness, question 26, inside the phone channel has a far greater influence on question 27, overall SAT, than does question 25, concern, right? In fact, it has a higher impact than all of these. Promptness and speaking to a person is a little bit closer, but these other ones are a little bit further back in terms of what customers value most. And so in this way, organizations are able across channels to see what it is that customers consider good and what it is that are influencing what their customers think about their brand. So that's one of the things that these top performers are doing, which is, whether it's through our service or through other services, this constant drive to understand what customers value most and also understand who are the influencers that are affecting the customer, the expectations rather, with any particular brand. Okay, so let's, hopefully I made that point and we can move on to really what these top performers that you saw represented here, how is it that they are performing. So first we're going to share some high-level stuff. IVR importance is moving up. So if you look at this trend line from 14 to 15 and 16, and between 15 and 16, there was a very large jump in the importance of IVR, and a couple of things are driving this. Number one, you have much better technology that's out there, right? So natural language is driving a higher degree of satisfaction. The other thing is the opt-out. Many organizations, even traditionally cost-driven organizations, like in the utilities as an example, are moving their agent opt-outs way up in the menu. They've just come to the conclusion that customers who are trying to get out and get to a rep are going to get there one way or the other, and we don't want to aggravate them unnecessarily. So we're seeing a lot more organizations as a whole make that move, and it's paying off. IVR actually outperforms phone as a channel now. Even the IVR routing portion, if you isolate it, scores above the actual phone call itself, and there's some reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that the experience has gotten so much better. In addition, there's customizable menus. In fact, when we look at our top performers, over 30% now offer customized menus, right? So if client A calls in, they're going to get one approach. If client B calls in, they're going to get a totally different approach, and so that is a number exclusive of natural language, where obviously the menu itself is dynamic and is designed to give a varied customer experience. This is a totally different menu for different customer types. So when you also see this importance jump go up within IVR, one of the things that it does tell us is that there is a large difference or disparity between those organizations doing it very well and those not doing so well. So in other words, 35% of the entire call is already determined before you get to a rep. Within that 35%, you have high performers and low performers. Those low performers are really getting hit very, very hard in terms of dissatisfaction. You're putting your CSRs at a significant disadvantage when that IVR experience is poor. It's the gateway to your organization, your brand. It just pays dividends to make that experience as positive as possible. But because the technology is where it is today, and many orgs have adopted it, but many other orgs have not adopted things like customized menu and natural language, and they haven't chosen to put the zero up front. When customers rather run into those organizations who haven't made that investment, it has an outweighed importance on the call on the negative. So the moral of the story here is, despite the fact and the prediction, or rather the prediction that, hey, IVR is dead, I hear that all the time. I hear a lot of organizations say we're not making an investment in our IVR. We would suggest that that not be the case if your goal is to create a differentiated customer experience, because it really has the power to set the tone down the line. When you think about the customer experience inside the IVR. Now, this is IVR routing. You can see that the number one driver is clarity, and it is growing again in importance year over year. It's been the number one driver by a long shot, but at the end of the day, it's getting more and more powerful. And all the clarity means is that the customer knows what to do. So inside the IVR, if the customer feels like they know what to do, or they feel like they have options, then everything else tends to take care of itself. So in order to improve this clarity, a good natural language engine is fantastic. Giving folks the ability to opt out, right, that creates an option for them, that relaxes them as they actually navigate through self-service options if they know they can get out. So one way to improve the customer experience is to do those things that I just mentioned, and it'll pay off in terms of the overall experience by improving the customer's clarity around what it is that you're offering them and giving them a chance to do. Okay, I wanted to touch real quickly on inside the IVR, right? So we ask this question. This is an example of a diagnostic question that we ask. We ask this question within the automated phone system. In addition, we ask this question of providing information more than once with the rep, and they both are having growing influence, right? In this particular case, so in terms of numbers that you can go back, inside the IVR, if the customer perceives they're having to provide information more than 27% of the time, then you're outside of where top performers essentially are delivering. So as good as the systems are getting, and they are getting better, even with top performers, it's still 27% or more than a quarter of the calls that customers are perceiving that they have to provide the same information more than once. Well, as we go through this, we'll see how, that is going to negatively affect the number one driver, which is timeliness of resolving the question, problem, or request. Two, that's also going to affect the promptness in getting to the rep. Three, it's obviously going to affect the perception of clarity if you're going along and suddenly within the system you're finding yourself having to input information more than once. That does not create a good feeling within the customer. So it's something worth looking at. This is just illustrative of a client. You can see on the left-hand side, the way you read this is that when you ask this question, did you have to provide the same information more than once? Average certified 27% said yes. When customers said yes, their overall CSAT score went from an 872 down to a 739. So it's a 146-point, a very significant drop on this particular metric. As you look at the customer that we had, the client, you could see that in their case it was a 146-point drop, and they had 42% of their customers say they need to repeat information. So it's one of the deadly sins, and it's something worth tracking. And anytime you're doing an RFP for a new IVR system, or if you're constructing your IVR system, keeping this particular outcome in mind, what can I do to ensure that the customer doesn't have to provide the same info more than once, will really improve the score, the customer experience, which manifests itself in the score, and also will give your reps a fighting chance, right? Because if customers are calling in, they aren't typically calling in because they have nothing to do and they just want to kill some time, right? They're calling in because they're stressed, and now they have to provide the same information more than once. That really adversely affects the experience and the mood, and when they do get to a rep, they're not in the place where they could have been if we as leaders within our organizations would have constructed the experience to make sure that no repetition was going on. But this is an area I bring it up because even the best still do it a lot, and it's an area, if you're a high performer listening to this call, that you can really look at and strive to reduce as a key metric inside your IVR. Okay, if we switch over from the IVR into the call itself, so this is scores around CSR performance. You can see on the far right-hand side, timeliness of answering the question or resolving the problem is on the far right-hand side. That's your number one driver. Number two is promptness in getting to the rep. 3, courtesy, 4, knowledge, and 5, concern. You can, one thing that you'll note as we go through these different channels and what is driving SAT the most by channel is that timeliness is the number one driver, right? So if we have to invest our limited resources in one thing, it's about collectively trying to get the customer's issues resolved in a timely way. The great news is that that notion of timeliness is both objective, but ultimately it's subjective. And in the sense that there are some very specific things that organizations can do to help the client understand their situation and ensure that the issue is actually being resolved in a timely manner, even when the actual amount of time taken to resolve the issue may be higher. You can, than another organization, you can actually have this score, this part of the score be higher if you become expert at setting expectations within your interaction. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about here in a bit. But timeliness is number one, and growing. You can see that concern is moving up a little bit year over year. It's still not up to where knowledge is or courtesy is, but it's just always interesting to see what's growing in importance and what is receding in importance. And I'll ask you to take note of concern as the number 5 driver here. You can see that it's growing in importance, but in other channels, concern is much higher, is a much larger driver of the customer experience than it is with the phone channel. So it's always important to look at each individual channel and see what's driving SAT. So let's do that with social. In this case, you can see courtesy is number 5. So obviously we are asking the same questions across these channels so that we can give you an idea of what is most important. That can hopefully help us understand why one attribute is more important than the other. You can see over here on the right-hand side inside social, timeliness is still number 1, but look, concern is now the number 2 driver. And in the previous slide, you saw that that was the number 5 driver. Conversely, courtesy was the number 3 driver, and now courtesy goes all the way down to number 5. So there's definitely some interesting phenomena going on, and concern is almost as important as timeliness. And now you move on to these other channels, and you start thinking about what does chat, email, social media have in common, and they're all written forms of communication within the channel. And you can see with these particular channels, look what's the number 2 driver in chat. It's concern, right? So in phone, it's number 5. In social, it's number 2. In chat, it's number 2. And in email, it's number 3. So there's obviously some interesting dynamics that's going on with concern. And so I think in the case of these written communications, it becomes very, very important that organizations who want to service their clients well are well trained in using active listening skills, reflecting active listening or active reading skills, if you will, in their responses back to their customers, and those customers are perceiving that to be concern, right? So in the phone call, folks can hear that tone come through, and even if you aren't saying some very specific words, the clients can feel the concern. And most organizations hire folks with high levels of empathy and things like concern and courtesy. Some of these soft skills come naturally to many folks in customer service, and as a result, it becomes more prevalent in customer service. Like many times, organizations may not be able to move as quickly as a customer would like, but that doesn't mean the customer doesn't feel at the rep level that, oh, this rep cares, but there are some things that are out of his or her hands that isn't reflective of the rep. What is reflective is that empathy, right, that is able to come through. In this case, whenever you have a written correspondence, you have to literally show it. Now, when you see things that, attributes that are of this higher degree of influence, that oftentimes goes with a very large disparity between those organizations who do it well and those who don't. In other words, out there in this customer service environment, you have organizations who are really, really focused on being empathetic in the written form, and customers can feel it. And when they don't feel it, it definitely affects the score more, right? So that's why chat on your left-hand side is the number 2 driver. This is all of these attributes keep getting bounced up against the overall satisfaction question. And so when we use our multivariate regression, we're able to identify the number 1, 2, 3, 4 drivers, right? All the drivers all the way down. And so, again, these very, very highly influenced attributes, or these attributes with higher influence, are oftentimes indicative of massive swings in performance. So this is one that you can very quickly usurp your competitors and move up. And this is one of the easier things that you can do, right? Sometimes there are constraints to really providing a timely resolution for a number of reasons. But this particular attribute, which is so important in written communications, is something that can be trained and QA'd against and coached against. So this would be something that I would encourage everybody to really, really focus on. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful. You could spend an hour going through all this stuff, but for the sake of time, we'll have to pick out some of the highlights, some of our conclusions, and move forward. So let's talk about some key metrics that top performers are mastering. So we get questions all the time around service level, and it's everyone wants to know, hey, what's the magic service level? And so I'm going to share with you some data that actually might be somewhat frustrating because it doesn't give you the answer. There's no magic bullet here. The reality, like in so many aspects of performance, the answer is it depends, right? So service level is not something that should be gone into lightly. Obviously, the service level then dictates pretty much everything else from an operational standpoint. Staffing wise and your workforce management is dependent upon service levels. When we go out to organizations, part of our benchmarking services and part of our certification program, we ask a lot of questions about their operations. So we're going to share with you what these top performers are doing. Now, In this particular case, it will really, like in all the cases, when you do benchmarking, you have to have a norming mechanism, right? So what we chose to create a norming mechanism is that we asked the question this way of our clients over the past 12 consecutive months, considering your average inbound performance time-based metrics, 80% of your calls are answered in how many seconds, right? So that's what our goal is. Some people would obviously, if we said give us your service level, would be all over the map and we couldn't help anybody. So by answering it this way, however, we're definitely able to get everyone on the same page. And what you'll see here is that, again, these are high performers. You can see that on average the higher performance is sitting out here at 890. So this 890 represents their average customer satisfaction score of all the respondents who fell, in this case, the 890, into between 20 and 25 seconds. So 80% of their calls were answered between 20 and 25 seconds. You can see that actually the lowest score is those organizations who answered the phone the quickest. So, and this illustrates an excellent point, I think, which is important, is that these top performers are doing a lot of other things right. So promptness in getting to an agent, that is the number 2 driver. So the question becomes is, how is it or why is it that organizations that are able to answer the phone more quickly, more consistently, would score lower? And even though it is the number 1 driver, other drivers play an important part, including overall timeliness of resolution. So on the far right-hand side, you can see that you have most of our certified clients not even answering the phone in 30 seconds in terms of 80% of their calls, right? So if you look and see what our average is, in fact, it's 44 seconds. So many folks on this phone call go, oh my gosh, I do that. That's something that is easy and a standard that I can easily meet. And we would say, for you all, 1, that's great, and 2, it really does call into question of why is your service level set where it is. So this is kind of a proxy. This isn't, an actual service level in the classic sense, but it can give you an idea that if you really understand what is the tolerance of your customers and the calls that they make in terms of answering the phone in context of all the other aspects of your service delivery model, you can get a much better idea of what your service level should be. It could be today that you're focused on that, and if you would focus more on other things like first contact resolution as an example, and all the operational things that you can do to affect that, that you could actually get away with a lower average speed of answer as an example. So anyways, I thought that this would be interesting and instructive. So when we talk about this being a KPI that top performers are mastering, it's not necessarily a KPI in the sense that this is the standard, right? Like the answer to this particular thing isn't necessarily, hey, it's 17 seconds is the answer, right? 80% of your calls are answered within 17 seconds. That's the magic number. No, the concept of mastering is taking into account all the conditions, all of the KPIs, putting it into your environment, ascribing it its appropriate weight, but not being necessarily blindly beholden to it. You can see in this illustration that there's a very wide variety of timings here that yield comparable scores. So to me, this was, like I said, we've got so many stats here, by the way, that are available for folks if you want to compare yourself to others. That's one of the other top performers. That's what this is meant to illustrate. You see the client X over there with the green triangle, or I'm sorry, diamond. That in the report that this client got, they actually were plotted here, and they could see where they fit in relative to others. But the service level is something that can be studied. It's something that can be calculated, and it is also something that can be moved around. You get certain call types at certain times, so the best companies are really, really getting down very granular as to, in half-hour increments, what are those calls like, what are the tolerance for those calls, and they're able to do that by correlating, average speed of answer with customer sat for certain call takes a lot of data, but again, if you're aspiring to become a top performer, it oftentimes does take that level of analysis to really understand your environment as fully as you can. Okay, another area of focus is agent attrition, right? There's different ways to measure it. We measure it all in. So this is actual data from our top performers. So the annual attrition rate for verified top performers, including voluntary and otherwise, is 29%, right? So for those folks, that's every single type of attrition. If you are achieving a real 29% attrition rate, then you are right up there, right? You're in the range of what these verified top performers are doing. So making sure you measure this and then break it out. In this case, we broke it out by promotional attrition. Many of the top performers, just like many of the folks on this call, I'm sure obviously promoting whenever possible from within. In the case of top performers, their 29% attrition rate, 37% of that is due to promotional attrition, either within the centers or to other groups who find that customer service experience so valuable to other parts of the business. Whereas 63% of the 29%, so the vast majority of this is the other attrition, whether one of your agents leaves on their own accord or you have to manage them out of the business, that accounts for 63% of the attrition. But obviously attrition is very important, again, to master. Unless we've figured out something that no one yet has been able to figure out, there's no such thing as 0% attrition, and attrition is always going to be a part of our reality with these assisted channels. But it's one of those magic stats, if you will, that if you can manage it and master it correctly, in other words, keep it as low as is practically possible, it obviously reduces your costs associated with recruiting, hiring, training, onboarding. Also, it reduces your costs in terms of oftentimes the first contact resolution is much lower with new agents than it is with folks who have been there a while. There's more transfers going on. The holds are longer with newer agents. There's all these costs associated with newness that is never going to go away, but if you could limit the number of folks who are having to be churned through your organization, there's tons of cost savings sitting there around attrition. And at the same time, if you're able to limit that attrition, your customer experience is going to go up. And assuming that you are, training properly, you have the proper incentives with your QA and coaching in place, and you're properly incentivizing them with your balanced scorecard, there are a lot of benefits that can be ascribed to lower attrition around the customer experience, customer retention, is oftentimes much higher. So attrition is just one of those magic KPIs that the lower it is, the better it is for cost savings and the better it is for revenue achievement. So hopefully this context helps you all understand what top performers are doing and that they're paying a lot of attention to attrition. All right, FCR. So we have a ton of questions on FCR, and of course the natural first question is how do you measure it? And that is something that is best answered, we think, by customers. At the end of the day, you can put all of your metrics in, and we would say not necessarily to avoid that, like repeat calls within 7 days, repeat calls within 30 days, whatever your metric is and how you figure it in math. We would say still continue to do that, but match that up, compare and contrast that number that you get with what customers say the resolution rate is. So in this case, we're giving you our formula, if you will, around first contact resolution. And so the way this works, if you look at this question, this is question number 4, and we ask our clients, and keep in mind, this is a agent-introduced IVR survey. So this is happening 48 hours after the contact, so it's still recent enough for folks to remember their diagnostics, but also take into account the full experience, and also really, because we also measure this from 2 to 5 days out, whether or not what the agent said was going to happen actually happened. They can check electronically, as an example, to see if there was a financial adjustment made in a statement, as an example, or if there was a follow-up email that came that confirmed that X, Y, and Z, the request that they had, actually manifested itself in some action on the service provider's part. So in this case, we figure FCR by asking 2 questions. The first question, which you don't see here, is was your issue, question, or problem that we're asking you about in this research resolved, yes or no? So all the no's are thrown out. All the yeses move to this question, which is please enter the number of times you contacted. So this is first contact resolution. In this case, you contacted our client about this particular question, problem, or change issue. And so when you combine those two, you can see that the average certified, when you ask it this way, is 72.7%. Most organizations have higher self-reported FCR than this. In fact, our client organizations have higher self-reported FCR. We would encourage you all as organizations to really focus in on what the customer is saying and using that as a proxy. And you can see, wow, you might be 15, 20 points off on your own, or in some cases you can be 40 points off on your own estimate of what FCR is if you look at it only from a data analysis standpoint, and you're excluding what the customer has to say. You can really, really miss the boat here. So you can just see the formula at the bottom as well. But hopefully this is helpful to you all around how we believe you should be measuring FCR. All right, real quick statement around the contact center practice. J.D. Power, we've had a CERT program since 2004, and we have obviously a lot of data around the contact center and across these channels that are mentioned on your right. So some of the services that we help organizations with are these benchmarking, some of the stuff that I shared with you earlier around the customer experience, KPIs, and best practices. We'll do customer satisfaction research, like some of the graphics that we showed you early on that compares you against verified top performers, allow you to prioritize your gaps, look at A, your biggest gaps, and B, operationally, what is most causal to those gaps. If you were to correct them to the exclusion of other things, you would get the biggest bang for your buck. So the value of having benchmarks and then comparing yourself to those top performers is you really get a unique understanding of where you might have gaps that you literally didn't even know you knew you had, right? If you've been bebopping along and doing a tracking study for years and seeing that your courtesy score is a solid 8.5 and you didn't realize that the average score for top performers is in the upper 8s or 9s, that will alert you to a gap that you didn't think you had but you actually do have that could be affecting your ability to compete and win the marketplace. And then when you have those gaps, that obviously leads to performance improvement. So we help many clients by helping them close those gaps specifically, and we help IVR improvement, we help general strategy, but at the end of the day, what we really help is if you want to drive a customer experience, a great customer experience, an improved one, what are the few things that you need to do and solve for, and to what degree do you need to solve for them? Like, for example, you have to reduce holds. We have many clients who the number one problem with their entire interaction that affects all those other attributes that I mentioned is that they put their customer on hold a lot, and they don't execute. Well, once you know that information, here is the formula for reducing holds and then 2, executing holds. So that's where performance improvement, and then there's recognition as well. So that's all I'm going to say about our practice. If you have an interest in seeing how we may be able to help you all get to the next level of performance, would love to chat with you about it. In fact, we'll send out this information, and my contact email is at the very end of this deck. All right, so what is it that top performers are doing now? So I have shown this before. I wanted just to touch on the basic premise that those of us on the phone, our jobs ultimately, if we are to help our agents, help our brands the most, is we want to facilitate the customer looking at us in the customer care side of things, customer service side. Look at us as trusted advisors. And so that means at the moment of truth, you want your agents or your chat bots, for that matter, to be proactive, relevant, and genuine, right? Anytime you can have the customer leave with that feeling that this agent, this representative of the brand, was proactive with me, and when they were proactive with things that mattered to me, and I could feel that they were a genuine person, and that genuineness comes through, i.e., you got to drop those scripts. If you have scripts, change them to call models and change your QA program. Now, if you have a compliance issue with, some banking laws or FTC or something like that where certain words have to be spoken, obviously, you need to script those out. But, that's a topic for another day around trying to create this feeling of genuineness, is move to call models and get away from scripting. But anyways, that's the notion. We want to create an environment where the customer believes that they are dealing with a trusted advisor at the end of the day. I won't get into this. This is a whole another 4 hours that we could sit and talk about this and what's going on now. But the takeaway here, again, is put that customer in the middle. There's everything that influences from the top and the bottom, but at the end of the day, we want the customer to feel like they dealt with a trusted advisor. So what are these folks who are managing attrition? Like, what is it that they're doing? And so these are some best practices that you all can do that we're seeing consistently. In fact, they've made their way into our best practices scorecard, and this is an element of part of our assessment, right? Whether it's certification or if you want to bounce your organization up against, you know, a couple hundred best practices, these best practices are in there, and we're seeing them being really adopted more and more often by these top performers, which is involve those frontliners in pre-planning ideation around key challenges in the upcoming year. So these great companies are saying, all right, the voice of the customer is telling us that we've got an issue with X. We are formally going to our front line to explain what our challenge is as an organization, getting their input, and making that entire process very overt. And then closing the loop around that. So if you look down at the very bottom here, recognize contribution of frontline, you need to do it by name, you need to include pictures. Many of you are running centers with 1,000 people in it. It's like a small city, right? They don't know who's on the next row from them, let alone across the center, but when you throw those pictures in there and recognition, suddenly people will say, you're that person who is recognized for excellence in this or that. And then in town halls and communications, keep pointing back as much as possible to the front line. That's going to engage your customer. You keep on hearing, you engage your internal customers, your frontline reps. You keep hearing that notion of employee engagement. This is not only an effective way to manage your operations, but really manage that engagement. Then share that operational strategy and area of focus with the front line immediately after that management dissemination. We talked to some companies, and their front line has no idea what their strategies are, what their priorities, what their areas of focus are. Top performers, if you want to reduce your attrition, especially of your high potentials, do these actions and activities, and you are going to be on your way to reducing attrition, increasing retention of high performers, and you're also going to help execute your initiatives much more quickly because people are bought in, right? They feel like they've been listened to and they were part of the solution. All right, manage, hold, and transition. So if you look at this, you can see that this is obviously, with this particular client, an issue. In this case, we see that 35% of top performers are putting their customers on hold, so it's a huge problem or challenge or reality, depending on how you want to look at it, right? If their holds are a reality. But now you know what you should be shooting at. That 35% is a good goal. And then really focus hard on managing. That means understanding that you're going to have a lot of holds, training to those holds, right? What do you do when you put a customer on hold? Trained that in your new hire training classes. Make sure that that's focused on and nesting, because it's going to happen at least 35% of the time, right? Coach to it, put it in the QA. In your QA system, you are looking for some very, very specific things around the hold process, around setting expectations. And those companies that pay attention and effectively manage hold and all transitions do much better than those organizations that don't. In this case, you can see a visual illustration when our client who put their customers on hold 58% of the time, they saw a 169-point index drop every time they did it, and they did it on 58% of their calls. You could see that this was a major reason why they did not score very well. And though it's still a degradation, you see that 892 on the right. So top performers who didn't put customers on hold, so that's 65% of the calls, scored an 892. When they put customers on hold, it went down to an 814, but you can see that that slope is much less pronounced. In other words, it didn't hurt them as much. So they're putting customers on hold less, and when they do it, they're executing better, right? So these are what these are the details that top performers are managing to, and that formula of setting expectations, gaining agreement and permission, is true for all transitions, not just holds. But I'm using holds here as an example. All right, so we just talked about transition. So the ultimate transition is getting off the call, right? So the close is very important. So we talked about FCR earlier. One way that you can improve and what our top performers are doing consistently is that they are summarizing what happened, and as important, they are saying in as much details as possible what the next steps are at the end of the call, i.e. what you should expect, when, very specific, and when you should expect it. That's going to reduce anxiety, right? People want confidence, they want certainty, they want information, and it allows them to not call you back because they're looking for a specific activity or action, like the mailing of a bill or a text that you're going to receive when the problem is solved, or an email that's going to confirm that the account balance has been taken care of. Whatever it is, when you articulate this is what's going to happen next, and this is, the best companies are able to integrate all their data and give the customer service rep that information so they're able to be proactive and relevant. Remember what we're trying to do with the frontline reps, be able to be proactive and relevant in telling them what to look for next. That right there is going to resolve many issues if you just do that. So managing the close is what top performers are doing, and they're putting it in their training, QA, and coaching. Okay, so those are, that's it. I know that we're up against time, but I really appreciate the time. I do have got a ton of questions here that I'll stay on for the next few minutes and try and answer some of these, but why don't I jump into this, and then obviously many of you have to go, but we're recording this so you can get answers to these questions when you download the recording. So here's a great question. Are customers still willing to complete surveys that have more than 10 questions to the level of detail of repeating information? Yeah, so here's the deal. When we look at best practices for research, there's a difference between tracking. So these are ongoing tracking surveys. So these are your very short questions. You're trying to track sentiment and maybe a few key diagnostics. These can be anywhere from, 1 question to 5 questions to up to 10 questions, but they're short. We totally get it and totally agree that that should happen. However, what we've seen is this massive move to those types of questions for all types of research, and we think that it's a mistake. And for the reasons that we illustrated, if you gather just top-level information of how satisfied were you, or your likelihood to, recommend, or what was your customer effort, those are fine questions, and you can get a trend line to it, but they're just not very actionable. So what we want to do is that you want to mix in your research. What we suggested here is not something like we're asking when our clients work with us. Yeah, these questions are 30 questions long in some cases, and I could hear the air going out of the room, and many of the folks who are listening right now. But believe me, your customers do answer those, especially if you do closed loop and you give customers insight into what you asked and what they answered, right? So you're closing the loop. You're making sure your customers know that you value the information. You're making changes based on customer feedback. So you're closing the loop. That'll increase your response rate. It'll make your customers of all types satisfied, not satisfied, if you want to invest the time by doing that. But you do these things very intermittently, right? So within our program, you're talking about doing it once every 6 months. Every 6 months, you do what we call a benchmarking study. These are these longer questionnaires that ask very detailed information that allows you to benchmark your performance, and then from that very detailed information you're getting, that's going to tell you precisely what to do in what order. Then you go off as a management team, fix those problems that the customer is telling you, very actionable, very prescriptive, and then don't ask it again for another 6 months. And then you're in the field for 1 week, 2 weeks, just a few weeks, right, for a period of time, and you're now comparing what you did the first time and all of those answers, like the example I gave earlier around holds. You're checking to see, did my hold percentage of calls that are put on hold go down because we're focusing, we root cause why we're putting them on hold, we're addressing that, then we're also effectively managing the hold, and then 6 months later, so you've been doing all your 5-question questionnaires, you do for another 2 or 3 weeks your benchmarking and see the improvement. Your index score is going to go up, so your 0 to 1,000 point scale, whatever scale you use, that should go up. And now you know the reason why it went up. And you might see, wow, we solved this problem. We closed this gap. Now what's the number one operational gap that if we close, we will move to the next level of performance? And you do that in 6-month increments because it takes time for the changes you're going to make to manifest themselves in the customer experience. So the long answer, the short answer to the question is, they do, but you have to give them a practical incentive and, doing your closed-loop feedback and getting back to those customers, especially those who gave you the information and others, will help folks invest their time, but we don't recommend that you do this all the time. You have to do it, look at it for what it is, a benchmark study, and do it every 6 months. Another question that we had is, do these chat waits shift for virtual assistants? So we asked our chat questions intentionally where that it doesn't matter, right? Because, in fact, it really doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a real person or dealing with a virtual assistant or a chatbot. Customers still value what they value. So, no, the waits don't change in a chatbot environment. Now, if you get into a virtual assistant where it's very clear that you've got this persona and it's a computer and it's a virtual assistant, you've given it a name, then now you've set the expectations differently, and in fact, you are very likely to get a different result. So we're re-upping, we're going through our chat benchmarking in the near term, and that'll be something that we'll try and tease out, right? When we know it's an overt virtual assistant, what does that do to expectations and importance weights? That's a fantastic question, and stay tuned. Next year we'll be able to share that data. So we appreciate, again, your time and your questions. All the other questions that I got, I'll turn them around on email. You can see my email right here, mark.miller@jdpa.com. But thank you for your attention, and if there's anything that we can do to help you benchmark, improve, and get recognized for your customer service, please reach out, and we'll be happy to chat with you and see if we can help. Thanks. Until next time. Bye.